My name is Reggie DeRoche. I am the chair of the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the inaugural Kenneth Hyatt Distinguished Alumni Leadership Speaker Series. I can't think of a better way to kick off the speaker series than to have someone who truly embodies leadership and impact as our first speaker. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to take a minute to thank the person that made this possible through his generosity and his vision. A leader in his own right, Ken Hyatt, a civil and environmental engineering grad from 1962, led Jim Walter Corp., the country's largest home builder at the time, with nearly 30,000 employees. Ken has devoted his career to helping inspire youth to be leaders and thought it would be important to expose students at Georgia Tech to great leaders who have made a contribution to society and have had an impact in the world. Ken continues to give much of his time and his energy to support many great causes, including the Boy Scouts of America, the Salvation Army, and the University of Tampa, which is where Ken resides, and of course, Georgia Tech. Ken, we'd like to thank you for all that you do for the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, for the Institute, and for the many great causes where you devote your time and your support. Please join me in thanking Ken for making this possible. We'll do a quick photo op, then we'll
great.
See you. I'd like to introduce Igel Kennedy, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural Ken Hyatt Leadership Distinguished Series. It's a distinct honor and a pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker, Dr. Wayne Clough. When we started our search for the inaugural speaker, we polled over 10,000 of our living alumni, 1,200 of our students, and 100 faculty and staff, and it was unanimous that there was one person they wanted to hear from, and that was none other than Dr. Wayne Clough. We also put together a selection committee, and they had the same sentiments. So the big question now is, how does one introduce Dr. Wayne Clough in 5 minutes? I think we need another inaugural lecture just to introduce him properly. But I'm going to do my best to draw out of some of his vast accomplishments that dovetail quite nicely with the intent of the Hyatt series. So Dr. Wayne Clough is the 10th president of Georgia Institute of Technology. He served as president from 1994 to 2008. And during his tenure as president, Georgia Tech's rankings rose into the top 10 among public universities. The student population increased from 13,000 to 19,000. Funding for external research more than doubled. And the G. Wayne Clough Georgia Tech Promise Scholarship was created. This allows financially disadvantaged students to graduate from Georgia Tech without accumulating debt. And to date, over 600 students from 87 different counties have benefited from it. He oversaw more than $1 billion in campus construction and improvements, including Tech Square, the Georgia Tech Hotel, and the Global Center, and the undergraduate learning commons in which we are now, which is 220,000 square feet, and was subsequently named after him. He served as the 12th secretary of the Smithsonian Institute from 2008 to 2014 when he left Georgia Tech, and his tenure there is also marked by a number of firsts. He had the first national fundraising campaign, a national branding initiative, an institute-wide commitment to sustainability, and also laid the framework for the digital Smithsonian. As secretary, he also presided over $1 billion worth of renovations and new construction. Dr. Clough has taught at Duke University, Stanford University, and Virginia Tech. He served as chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and as dean of the College of Engineering at Virginia Tech. He also served as provost and vice provost at University of Washington. As a native of Douglas, Georgia, Dr. Clough studied civil engineering at Georgia Tech, earning his bachelor's in 1964 and his master's in 65. I wasn't born then. That means a lot of wisdom. He went on to UC Berkeley to receive his PhD. And he has numerous awards and honors, and I'm going to list some of them to end this. You can Google the rest of them. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1990, elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2010. He has received honorary doctorates from 10 institutions. He has received the National Academy of Engineering's Arthur M. Beach Award in 2008 for National Service in Public Policy. He has 2 Norman Medals from the American Society of Civil Engineering. That's a rare honor. He has the Opal Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Society of Civil Engineering. He has received the Ralph Coates Rowe Medal from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And he also received the Silver Order of the DeFleury Medal from the Army Corps of Engineers for his service in rebuilding the hurricane protection system in New Orleans. Dr. Clough will talk to us this afternoon about climate change and its impacts and implications on engineering for the future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wayne Clough.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for that wonderful introduction, more generous than it should be. And thanks to Ken for sponsoring this lectureship series, which is so important to sort of getting excitement into the intellectual atmosphere around civil engineering and engineers in general and where it's going. And congratulations to Reggie for taking care of my home department. And it's great to see so many friends here and distinguished members of the administration, Rafael Brasu, the provost, and actually worked with me on the panel for Katrina, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Many friends who are here, I won't call you old friends, but I've known a lot of you for a long time. And so it's fun to see you, and it's fun to be back. For some of you, you may know I'm now have an office in the Mason Building in civil engineering, and so this is my tryout for tenure in the civil engineering department I'm working on. So this is a talk I've worked on for a long time, and I've had a lot of help to put this together, and I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge Leah Lemire, who's helping me, actually with the staff here in the Clough Commons, who've done a great job of preparing this for you today. Dave Haddock, who's a young man who's worked with me at the Smithsonian for a couple of years on this basic topic, and so many others who've helped put this together, and I'll acknowledge them as I go along, Smithsonian scientists and others. Aaron Cormack, who's my executive assistant now here at Georgia Tech, who's really helped put this together. So a lot of people to thank. Ken, I thought about this when someone asked me to be your inaugural lecturer, and I thought I'd pick a topic that was non-controversial to get it started. But climate change is very much in the air. It's very much in the news, and it's topical. One of the things that tends to be missing from that dialogue are engineers, and I really think that's a problem, and I want to talk a little bit about that today. And I really want to talk about this, in essence, through a story. I've been at the Smithsonian for almost 7 years, and the Smithsonian is a storyteller, and I know how important that is. When I was president of Georgia Tech is sort of when my real inauguration into the subject of climate change started, because people thought, as president of Georgia Tech, I knew a lot of things, sometimes mistakenly. But people would come up to me and ask me a question about climate change, just to see what I was doing. It usually started like this. Dr. Clough, I think this whole thing about climate change is hogwash. What's your opinion? And so I had a hard time really explaining where this was going, because it was a very important topic. But the first time it became really in my face was when Rafael and I were working on this commission with the Corps of Engineers overseeing the construction for the hurricane protection system for New Orleans, the rebuilding of it. And the first time it became obvious to us was we asked the question, what was the freeboard of the existing system? How much freeboard did you have for a given size of event? And they said, we don't know. And I said, why don't you know that? And one of the reasons was the Gulf has risen over the last 200 years. Some of those levels in New Orleans are 200 years old. And the Gulf has risen. Sea level has risen over that period of time, as I'll talk about a little bit later on. That cut down on the freeboard. Well, then that raises the question, you're building a new system, how long is it going to last? And we talked to the Corps of Engineers about how much this might cost, and they said probably $15 billion. That's our money, $15 billion. So you ask the question then to yourself, you can do this mentally, if you will, while I'm talking. If you spend $15 billion on something, how long do you want it to be viable to protect you? Okay, just think about that a second. Most people will say 100 years. Some people will say 200 years. Then the question comes, where is sea level going to be in 100 years? Now, as civil engineers and mechanical engineers and many others, we have code of ethics. And they all start the same way. The most important thing for an engineer to consider in their design is public safety and welfare. And it doesn't mean when you finish the project. It means when it's needed. And so the question is, will this protect the public welfare for 100 years? Or will we have another disaster where we lost 2,000 lives at $100 billion in Katrina? And so the answer we have to ask ourselves as engineers is, where do we want to design? And clearly we have to consider the possibility of sea level rise. We had a person on our panel from Holland. You know what Holland's doing? They're below sea level. They're adding 2.5 feet to their system because that's their estimate of sea level rise in the next 100 years or so. Well, should we add 2.5 feet? Well, we thought a lot about that. And as we were wrestling with this question in our deliberations, and we were actually holding public hearings with the citizens of New Orleans, very emotional kind of thing, we were told what the answer was by FEMA. A bureaucracy in Washington had the answer for us. They never asked us what we thought. They said, you will design those levels, elevations, for a 1 in 100-year flood. That was their response. Now, if you live downstream from a dam, you should feel pretty good, because you don't design a dam in the United States for less than a 1 in a 500-year flood. So why should you build a system for 1 million people who live below sea level for 1 in 100? Well, it's a good question. And that's one of the questions we have here. And that's why engineers should be part of this dialogue. They should not be left out of this dialogue. Bureaucrats should not be making these decisions without the input of engineers and people who are knowledgeable about these subjects. Now, the decision may be the same thing. And one of the things we're going to learn in this talk is that you have to make a lot of compromises, because people aren't sure about climate change yet. They're not sure about it. And our government today doesn't spend money on its highway system. So is it really going to start spending money on something that's to come? Those are all questions we have to answer as a society, and we need our voices in that. So climate change, we have to think about it, and we have to think about what it means for engineers. I'm not here to talk about the nuances of climate science. I'm going to talk about the implications of what it means to us. Next slide. Next slide. I want to bring up the date, because if you're like me, read the newspapers and you see a lot going on. There's usually an article every other week on climate change, or more frequently, about climate change. And there's been a flurry of new publications that are all worth thinking about. And so late last year, there was a climate summit held at the United Nations talking about climate change around the world and the implications for the world. An interesting thing happened. 300,000 people marched down the main streets of New York City demonstrating, saying we need to get serious about climate change. Well, that was kind of new. That was different. People really get excited about this now, you know. It's kind of a good thing. Next slide. And we also had our president meeting with the leader of China, coming to an agreement that we would try to do something to mitigate, and I use that word a lot, the effects of climate change for these two countries. They're important because they're the two biggest emitters of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There are lots of other countries, and when you bring 100 countries together, they never can come to an agreement. But these two countries came to an agreement. They said, we're going to do something about it. It wasn't perfect, and a lot of people poo-pooed it, and there are people in Washington and different political parties who said, we don't care about that. Maybe. But I think it was a historic move. It was a time when two countries got together and said, there's something serious going on, and we ought to do something about it. And here are some steps that we would take. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next slide. Okay, the United Nations has this thing called the Interagency Panel on Climate Change. They issued their latest report in 2014. There have been a series of these things. They've been criticized, but they do have some very interesting evidence, if you will, about climate change and a lot of science. You can take issue with it if you want, go ahead, but it's there. This is very interesting reading and very substantive reading for it. Well, let's say for a moment that you're one of those folks who said, I don't care what the United Nations writes, I don't care about it. Next slide. Let's get a little closer to home. Every 4 years, the United States does a climate assessment, and last year was the 3rd such climate assessment. And it takes the benefit of all of these agencies that we have here, including the Smithsonian, all of the expertise in these agencies, and ask the question about climate change. Is it occurring? What's causing it? And what are we concerned about? And it's a wonderful report, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to read it. It's not that long. It's a great report. Now, out of that came a series of exercises that every agency was asked to develop an adaptation report. You'll hear that word a lot. How do you adapt to certain types of climate scenarios in the future? And the reasons why you have to think about that. Next slide. Every agency has one. I didn't read them all, but I read a number of them. And two that I found most profound, Department of Agriculture and the Department of Defense. These two folks have real stakes, things at risk. Our food and water and our national security. And they talk very seriously in these reports about what's at risk as a result of climate change. And it's sobering. You know, if you get away from the arguments about what's causing climate change and you come back to the fundamentals and say, what if it happened? What if these things happen? It's pretty serious stuff. And you start thinking about what you could possibly do about it. Now, these plans are called adaptation. And that's adjusting to what is, as opposed to trying to change what might be, which is mitigation. But we'll talk about both of those approaches as we get a little further into this presentation. But these two I would encourage you to read. They are very, very good documents. They give you a good overview of the concerns that our Defense Department has. For example, the Arctic ice melts, it changes our national security posture entirely. If the bases in the Philippines and in Norfolk go underwater, that's a serious problem for our national military and our national security. Next slide. What I'd like to do now is to spend a little time with you on this journey of mine, because when I went to the Smithsonian, I had the opportunity to visit with our scientists and scholars who work all over the world. And people don't realize when you look at the Smithsonian, you see those great museums, that there are 500 PhD scientists working at the Smithsonian in all over the world in astrophysics, on land and in the oceans. And they're fascinating people who've done their work for a long time, and they have great insights. And so I learned a lot being around those folks. And so I talk a little bit from space, only that in 2018, NASA will launch a satellite called TIPO, which is Smithsonian New One. And it's the first time we'll have a satellite in space dedicated only to watching the pollution in North America on a very continuous basis. We can't do that today, but we'll have that in the future. So I'm going to skip that part and come back to the land and the sea. Next slide. And the talk, as you remember, says from the Eocene to the Anthropocene. And those are geologic epochs. The Eocene started about 56 million years ago, after the Paleocene. And about 10 million years after the dinosaurs disappeared as a result of a meteorite strike and other things. And that's an interesting period to us when we look at climate change, and to many scientists. It's a period when there was an unusual amount of carbon expelled into the atmosphere, somewhat like we see today, a lot of carbon going in the atmosphere. And we can learn a lot from this period. It's called the Paleoeocene Thermal Maximum by the experts, or PETM for short. Now, I'm standing in the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, not far from where Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid holed up in the Hole in the Wall gang hideout. But this is the Bighorn Basin, and it was a sediment basin. It was uplifted and streams down cut through it. And so those streams cut down so far into those sediments, you can look back 60 million years. So you can see the PETM here. And over here on the left is a friend of mine who I really admire, Smithsonian scientist named Scott Ring, who's a paleobotanist. And Scott got interested in this period, and he said, I'm going to find a land-based way to look at this as opposed to the sea-based. And he was a paleobotanist. So he spent 5 or 6 years out here looking for a way to find that 55 million year period and then to start analyzing. He spent 20 years doing it, and he's still doing it. So I went out and camped out with he and his colleagues and the students that were there, and they collect specimens. And I cracked that specimen open, and that's a leaf from 55 million years ago that's clearly is a tropical leaf. And so this is a very warm period of time. But that's not the real important stuff, is that Scott and his colleagues have been able to take these and dissect them and analyze carbon signatures. And what they learned was that climate change in periods of high excursions of carbon doesn't happen all at once. It takes a little while, but once the carbon cycle gets out of whack, it does funny things. And in fact, it can get so far out of whack that carbon from other places will start coming out. For example, the oceans, which is a massive carbon sink, and down at the bottom of the oceans are methylsilicates and carbon silicates that are frozen. And if those things release their carbon, the world changes dramatically. So let's take a look at the next slide. This is the PETM, as it's described by scientists. It was a period of a massive expulsion of carbon in the air over a relatively short period of time, and there were no humans. Okay? So no argument about humans causing this. You can get away from that one. Just think, this is Mother Nature at its best. Carbon dioxide level 1,000 parts per million. Today, we just crossed 400. We just went over 400. Global warming, 7 to 14 degrees, actually centigrade, I should say. Dissolution of marine chalk. Now what that means is there was so much carbon in the air that when it touched the seawater, it turned into carbonic acid, and the oceans acidified. And creatures that made shells could no longer make shells. Oysters, all those creatures could no longer make shells. And their larvae died because they were sensitive to acidity. Anything like that going on today? Anybody read the newspaper reports about Puget Sound and the oyster farmers out there? Their larvae are disappearing because the oceans are acidifying as we're sitting here talking about it. So dissolution of marine chalk means you can drill down 55 million years ago and you don't find any shells. It was a different world, huh? And then the PETM lasted about 100 to 200,000 years. That's a pretty interesting number because we in this room are what is called Homo sapiens, wise men. That's what it means, wise men. We've been around maybe 150,000 years. That's how long our species has been on this earth. And this period lasted 200,000 years. Long time for the weather to get squirrely. Okay? So then the question in my mind, a lot of times you look at these numbers, what does that really mean? What does that look like? Next slide. I like this slide. This is the Arctic north of Canada, and obviously someone who lives up there on a regular basis. And this is where I grew up. That's the Okefenokee Swamp. I grew up in Douglas, Georgia, right outside the Okefenokee Swamp. That's what this looked like 55 million years ago. So when you learn about the Earth, you do change things a lot as it happened in the PETM. This became that. All the ice on the Earth disappeared. All of it. Next slide. So what does that mean in terms of sea level? When the glacial ice, the continental glacial ice from Antarctica and Greenland disappear. That's a 250-foot high sea level rise. And that's what it looks like. And that tells you something, incidentally, that's important about global warming. There are winners and there are losers. When things get warm, some species are going to like it, and some species are going to disappear. That's the way it works. Trees, animals, whatever you name it, humans. So when you look at this slide, you say, well, okay, hey, Florida's a loser. Gone. Bang, gone. So where's the winner? Well, here's the good news for me. Right here's where I was born. At Douglas, Georgia. The crossroads of Peterson and Ward Avenue, which is the crossroads of that town, is elevation 250. So when this happened, Douglas is like Daytona Beach. So Douglas is the winner. What are other losers here? Savannah's gone, Wilmington's gone, Washington, D.C. is gone, Boston is gone, New York City is gone.
What about Athens?
I'm sorry?
Athens.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Gone?
Yeah, a lot more gone. And over here on the West Coast, Los Angeles is gone, San Francisco is gone, Seattle is gone. So that's a lot of sea level rise. So sea level rise is an issue, a question about how long it's going to take. So there's also a question in this slide of rate. How fast is it going to happen, and can we adapt to it? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now we're going to shift gears. We're out of that 55 million years ago thing. We're going to move up to about 5 million up to an orbital satellite drilling site with another great friend of mine, Rick Potts from the Smithsonian, a great paleontologist who's worked in the Rift Zone for probably 40 years. And Rick, as he was standing in one of his field sites, it was raining, and he noticed stuff ponding out there, and he said, you know, I wonder if this has ever been a lake. And so he got interested in that. And so he brought out a drilling rig out here, and it turns out it has been a lake many times before, depending on the weather conditions and climate. And so next slide, Rick and his colleagues got interested in taking these cores and asking the question, what's the correlation between climate change and all those species they've found? Next slide. And this is what they found. You can't read this, I'm going to have to tell you, you have to take my word for it. These light zones here are periods where Rick and his folks were able to establish was high rate of climate change. High rate of climate change. And these are different hominoid species. That's how long they lasted. And some lasted a fair amount of time. But what you see is that a lot of them start in a period after some climate variability. People, if they're hominoids and they're smart enough, they will adapt to climate change. And if they sort of run out of gas at some point, they end in a period of climate change. They get too specialized, they can't adapt. And so what you have is a story here that says humans can possibly adapt, and if they don't, they go extinct. So all human species that existed before Homo sapiens are gone. They're all gone. We're the last ones left, and we have a question of climate change. So will we adapt or not? That's the question. Next slide. So a little bit about natural systems. Again, the Smithsonian does this wonderful work with natural systems. And so they have a system of measuring forest health and growth and change called Forest Global Earth Observatories in 61 places, lots and lots of different partners. And they've been doing this now for 50 years. And what they are seeing in these observations is, and there I'm standing in the tropical rainforest in Panama, is that forests are changing very quickly. There's no question natural systems are changing. So it's changing because the climate's changing. Some trees and some legumes are growing faster, and some are going away. So a very dramatic effect on the natural forest systems around the world. Next slide. All right. If that's happening in forests, how about water? And so we just started a new initiative while I was there at the Smithsonian with the help of a Georgia Tech graduate, Michael Tenenbaum. We're creating marine observatories around the world, a biogenomic observatory to watch the changes in the biogenome of the coastal waters as a result of climate change and other changes that are happening around the world. And that's important because that informs all of us if we have hard data to work with and not just people making rash statements. And so as secretary, I got to do some nice things. That's enjoyable. On Caribou Key, which is off the coast of Belize, a beautiful reef system, deep water, shallow water reef system, mangrove reef system. And all it's at risk for environmental damage, but also changing rapidly, because coral is an animal, and it's very sensitive to temperature and acid levels, pH levels. And we've already probably lost 50% of the coral in the world. And during the Permian, the coral disappeared for 10 million years. So coral are in trouble. Some creatures are more sensitive than others. The reef is important to us because it absorbs carbon and it helps make fish. And when they go away, it will change our world if they go away. So we have to be worried about that. Next slide. Mary Hagedorn is a Smithsonian scientist who's very worried about that, to the point where she invented a method for cryogenically storing reproductive tissue of coral, so she can reimplant them to places where they might grow when they lost out somewhere else. And she can show you in 1 hour how she can take these specimens that have been frozen for 10 years and put them back together, and they start reproducing again. So people like Mary are thinking way ahead, and this is a coral bloom occurring in her lab and actually on the coast there in Hawaii. But she's very, very concerned, as all scientists are, about the health of coral reefs. Next slide. Now, people are involved, and the Smithsonian studies people through anthropology. And it particularly got involved in Alaska 160 years ago, and it continues that involvement with the indigenous peoples there. And I had a chance to visit St. Lawrence Island, and my wife were there, and meet with the elders of the Yupik people. And we talked about climate change, and they are fearful because the ice front is moving further back. Their open boats cannot reach them to hunt anymore. The summer storms are getting fiercer, and the tundra under them is melting. So their houses are sinking, their lakes are going away. They are the canary in the mine, if you will. Very dramatic changes in climate in the Arctic. And the Yupik people who've been there for 5,000 years know it. And so very dramatic change again with people. Next slide. Birds, another part of the natural system. The Smithsonian observes migratory patterns of birds, and they're changing dramatically because birds have to go places to find food, and blooming is occurring at different times and earlier, and the birds are moving to follow those. That will change forests because birds eat and then they poop and they actually fertilize forest, and when they don't do that, the forests themselves also will change. And it's estimated that 40% of the birds are at risk because of changing habitat conditions for them in the next 100 years. Next slide. And we're getting to the last of these slides. The Smithsonian is famous for its scientific collections. It has 127 million scientific specimens, has 138 million total objects in the collections. Fabulous, amazing collections. And this is Jeremy Jacobs, scientist at the Smithsonian, who is an amazing guy and presently is in charge of the reptile and amphibian collection. And what Jeremy is showing me is a jar full of Georgia salamanders. These are all from Georgia, North Georgia and South Georgia. And what's happening to salamanders across the southeast is they're getting smaller and they're dying out. And salamanders are, again, like the canary in the mine. They're creatures that are quite sensitive to temperature and acidity. And so without asking the question about what's going on, something's going on. Because this now ends that part of my presentation, but every part of the natural system is changing. So climate change is occurring, and it's occurring quicker than we thought it would occur, and it's something we need to be concerned about, both from the point of view of the future of the natural world that we live in and thrive on, and also because it will affect us as well. Next slide. So, welcome to the Anthropocene. The geologic epochs are named with these funny names, long names, if you will. A new epoch means something is happening in that period of time that will leave a mark in the Earth's crust that people 100 million years will see. So it's permanent, if you will, permanent. And so we've marched through the Pleistocene, which started about 2.6 million years ago, ended about 11,000 years ago, hit the Holocene, and bang, somebody suggested that we may be in a new era named Paul Crutzen, who was the discoverer of the ozone hole, who taught at Georgia Tech for a period of time. The Anthropocene. What is it we are doing that people 100 million years from now will see? Well, they will see the fact that we set off atomic bombs. because there will be high levels of radiation in the ground when they get to our era. And they will see that we burned a lot of carbon, especially in the 1800s and so forth, carbon black. There will be a black layer there left by us. And there will be plastics. We invented plastics in 1925, and they're everywhere. They're in the oceans, they're in the ground. A recent study of a beach in England found that 15% of the sand was actually plastic. Plastic is everywhere. So we are leaving our mark, for better or worse. So this is called the age of man, the Anthropocene. Not official yet, but it's being used in that kind of terminology. Next slide. All right, now let's get back to this slippery slope called temperature, which everybody is debating and is a constant topic of debate in some ways. First, we start back here with our friend the Pedum, way back here 55 million years ago. And you can see it was way up there compared to today. That's 0. That's up at 12 degrees C or 13 degrees C is as high as it got. And the interesting thing is, if we're in a period of global warming, why does this keep going down? Well, overall, it has been going down, overall. But there are lots of ups and downs and excursions, particularly down here. And that's because this is where the Isthmus of Panama was closed, and we started with 22 glaciations in North America, and that drove the temperature up and down, up and down, up and down. So we're in the tail end of this today. So next slide. So what's going on? Why are people all concerned about it? So this is what people report as the land-ocean temperature index. And in 1910, it hit bottom, and it's been roughly going up ever since about 1 degree C. 1 degree C, not a lot. But it's a trend, and it's something that's got people concerned. Now, temperature, as I said, is a slippery slope. It is a very erratic parameter because it can change from year to year. Somebody can claim, hey, it's getting colder because it's colder this year than it was last. Of course you can, because temperature is subject to many different factors. But overall, temperature is headed up. And that got people a little bit concerned. So this is the Anthropocene effect that people talk about. Next slide. Now let's come back to this carbon business. Carbon is part of the carbon cycle, like the water cycle on Earth. It's very fundamental to the Earth's balance, and it can get out of whack. The Pedum got out of whack because carbon got over 1,000 parts per million, and it came on down, and we've been waddling around in this area over here for the last 10 million years or so. Next slide. And so if we look at the last 800,000 years, it was pretty low. It was around 200 or so parts per million, and then it kicked up right about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And it's been going up ever since. And this is 2008 observed. Well, 2015 observed is about 400. And there are people who say over 400 things the carbon cycle begins to get unstable a little bit, and they get very concerned about it. You can argue about that or not. But nonetheless, it's going up. And that's what we call the Anthropocene. So these two things presumably, now there are lots more greenhouse gases than carbon. There's methane, which is a very serious problem, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and so forth. But carbon stays around a long time. It's part of the fundamentals of who we are. Next slide. This is an interesting little diagram out of Science Magazine that I thought was interesting, because it helps me, anyway, understand time. Time is a hard thing for human beings to understand. We don't live very long, actually, when you think about it. Well, if you look back about 10,000 years ago, this is a nice, interesting picture here. You've got a megatherium and you've got a mammoth. And both of them are being speared by humans because humans just arrived in Georgia. You could say this is a picture of Georgia 10,000 years ago. And these guys were roaming around in Georgia. And these guys arrived, and the big guys disappeared. The big meat lockers left. That was an easy solution to food, is gun those guys down, and you got food. And then we spent a long time not doing a lot different than that, other than hunting different animals. And finally, we hit the Industrial Revolution, and we started a carbon-based fuel dependency, which extends to today. And right about here, 200 years ago, there were 1 billion people. Right here, there were 1 million people. Here, 1 billion. And today, there are 7 billion. We added 6 billion people from here to here. And we use a lot of carbon in the process because we eat, we travel, we heat, We want to cool ourselves based on carbon-based fuel. So we took 1 billion and made it 7 billion, largely based on a carbon-based fuel cycle. And then this thing goes on to the future. So in 2050, most people would suggest there will be 3 billion more people on the planet, 3 billion more than we have today. And by the end of the century, there will at least be another 2 billion. 5 billion more. Can you add 5 billion more doing the same thing we did in this interval? And the answer is probably not. Probably not a good idea. We're using up resources, we're polluting the planet in many different ways. And we need to think about how we do it differently. That doesn't mean we get away with carbon-based fuels, because we need them, but we may use them in a different way. So this gives you some idea about that and the thinking about getting here. Next slide. Okay, this one I like, because I'm a civil engineer. I got to think about sea level here, because I got to build some seawalls. And if the sea level is going up, we're going to build some. But you got to put it in perspective. And the perspective is that 20,000 years ago was the last ice age, and sea level was 400 feet below where it is today. So the shoreline for Georgia was way out there from where it is today. And then it gradually, as things warmed up, it gradually came up, and it came up 400 feet. 400 feet. Next slide. But let's concentrate on that last little bit. And that last little bit from, say, 1870 to today is a 9-inch increase, and it's kind of going up. Now, 9 inches is not a lot, considering it went up 400 feet, but it's 9 inches in a relatively short period of time when you think about the amount of time that we're talking about here. Some people will argue that the paper this came out says 8 inches because these are based on tidal measurements, and those tidal gauges can be exaggerating. But nonetheless, it's 8 to 9 inches, and that brings you to that question, what's next? What's next? And where in the world would you get all the way up to 250 feet of water that we talked about before? So next slide. That brings you to this picture. Now, this being Georgia Tech, I have to start with the question about what I'm wearing. And I want to assure you, this may have been designed by a University of Georgia graduate, but this is what you get, no matter who you are, when you go to Christchurch before you go down to the South Pole. And they don't stop you at the Christchurch coal place and say, oh, you're from Georgia Tech, we got yellow stuff over here. They say, you wear the big red. So I'm wearing the big red because everybody wears the big red. Okay, so from the science point of view here, I'm standing at 9,500 feet. But land here is only 500 feet high. So I'm standing on 9,000 feet of ice. And so if this melted, that would bring up sea level 225 feet. It's a lot. There's a lot of capacity there, right? Next slide. Is anything happening? Paper just last week about the Totten Glacier, this one over here, melting because warm seawater is getting under that glacier. And that glacier, if it melted, would be 11 feet of sea level increase. If the Greenland continental glacier melted, that would be 25 feet of sea level increase. So the capacity is there. The question is, how fast will it get there? Next slide. Do we have any evidence for it? It depends a little bit where you live. If you live in Norfolk where the currents push shoreward, you're going to see it more quickly. And so that 9 inches that I showed you earlier is about 1.5 feet in Norfolk. And this museum, the Chrysler Museum, is a serious water problem. And they have this kind of event now on a frequent basis in Norfolk. On a frequent basis, something they've never seen before. Next slide. If we had a 10-foot sea level rise, I like to think about this in terms of my previous experience at the Smithsonian, and you wanted to see your favorite Smithsonian museum, you would have to get a boat. 10 feet would create this body of water in Washington, D.C. It's a lot of water. Next slide. If you had 25 feet, the Greenland ice cap would melt, and this is the Jefferson Monument. Mr. Jefferson standing in there, his toes would be wet. And you need a boat to see Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of sea level rise and implications as a result of sea level rise. Next slide. So what is Washington doing about it? The Corps of Engineers said, this is a serious problem. We should build a flood wall. And that made civil engineers happy. Jobs, right? And they built this flood wall. It's there, you can see it. It actually looks like this because it only looks like this when there's a flood. But the problem in Washington is the sea level rise comes in through the tidal basin. And it goes down what's called 17th Street. The Washington Monument's right here, the White House is right here. And it takes a right turn on Constitution Avenue. That's the lowest part of what used to be the Tiber River, used to be there. And so that little seawall is going right there. This seawall cost $10 million. So we're protecting the city of Washington with a $10 million seawall. And a wonderful article was written about how this is going to protect you against a 1 in a 500-year event. That's encouraging, but you need to think about that. You need to think a little bit more about that. Can you get away with $10 billion when you just spent $13 billion in New Orleans? You have to answer that question. Next slide. Why is it important to things like the Smithsonian? Here's 17th Street down here, water comes down Constitution, and already every one of these buildings on this Constitution Avenue have been flooded multiple times. And if you're over here going to a restaurant in Georgetown, over on this side, you can't get in those restaurants sometimes. It happened twice this year. Because sea level's up enough that when you get a high tide, it's flooding. So something's going on, and we should be concerned about it. This thing here is a new building that's being built, the African American History and Culture Museum, $540 million, and it has been designed to try to deal with this problem, but given the cost, you couldn't do it all. So that's sea level rise. Now the next story is surge, because surge is on top of sea level rise. And so we're going to take a quick excursion here and look back at Katrina. Hurricane Katrina, of course, was a Category 5. It was probably Category 3 when it hit ground, and it came out of the Gulf in this way, and Raphael and I helped write this report, which some people ignored, but we still think it's got some good ideas in it. Next slide. And you have to remember back to Katrina. It tracked this way. And that's the worst track it could have taken for those states down there because hurricanes rotate in this direction. So keep in mind, here's New Orleans sitting over here. So that hurricane comes up and it creates a surge from east to west, and it keeps going up, and then it creates a surge from north to south. So New Orleans got hit by 2 surges. And New Orleans got hit by a 23-foot surge. That's all water. Next slide. So when those surges came in contact with a poorly designed system, nature won. And those levees were wiped out along the east side of New Orleans, coming out of Lake Bourne. That big surge, kind of 23-foot surge, just went right over it. And as it went further up and started coming down from Lake Pontchartrain, it surged right down to these channels, and those broke, and the city was flooded. Next slide. And you remember, 2,000 people died. Thousands of more were displaced from their homes, some still displaced from their homes. There was $100 billion in damages. $100 billion in damages. And Raphael, remember when I tell people about this story, that this was such a sad story, and now we've at least built a system back that will not fail. They say, well, those crazy people in New Orleans, they shouldn't have moved there. That was the response from a lot of people. Next slide. So, brand new system. It can be overtopped because it was designed for 1 in 100. So what we told New Orleans is keep your evacuation plans shiny. Because while this won't fail, it's going to be overtopped. Because Katrina is a 1 in 300 event. It's not designed for Katrina. So New Orleans has been very lucky so far not to be hit by another hurricane. So if those people in New Orleans are crazy, what about those people, in next slide, in New York City? Hurricane Sandy was only a Category 2. It was a big storm, and it stuck around a long time. But it flooded New York City. Can you believe that? The subway was flooded. Half the city went dark for a long time. 60 people were killed. $65 billion in damages. Okay, so why was that important to the Smithsonian? Next slide. We have a museum down in Battery Park. And I had people who stayed in the middle of a hurricane at the risk of their lives to protect our artwork because the bottom floor of that building was flooded. And they stayed to keep those pumps running and to protect the great artifacts that are housed in that museum, right down in this area here. So it affected the Smithsonian very dramatically, and it was important. Next slide. So New York is saying, we must build flood walls. So New York is going to spend $25 billion for its flood walls. $25 billion. That would have been really good if they built it before. They wouldn't have suffered $60 billion in damages and 60 people wouldn't have died. But they didn't, because nobody was thinking about it. Everybody was thinking of those crazy people in New Orleans. Well, okay, it can happen to anybody. So now we come to the engineering part of this story very quickly. Next slide. The National Academies have thought about this and written some very thoughtful reports. I participated in the early one. I had to resign from the board when I was at the Smithsonian. But they point out that there are two ways of looking at this. One is adaptation. Remember, we've been talking a lot about adaptation. That's building flood walls. Building flood walls. And or getting people to move or whatever you can do to adapt to the circumstances. Now keep in mind also, when we talk about adaptation, we added 6 billion people since 1800. And where did those people live? 75% of them settled near the coast and helped us build big cities. We had put ourselves in harm's way. Every city on the East Coast, every city on the West Coast is in harm's way. And you can try to adapt your way out of this, but you will not win that battle because you cannot build it big enough, you cannot get enough money, do it. You have to combine it with mitigation. You have to slow this strain down. And we need to assume that we can do that. One without the other does not work. But mitigation is a way to slow it down so adaptation can work. But we've already put so much carbon into the atmosphere, it's going to keep driving for at least another 100 to 150 years, even if we get truly serious about mitigation. And we have. There are some encouraging signs. And we may have to intervene in the climate, which is the latest publication from the National Academy. So again, if you like to read these kind of things, these are documents I think that are really worth reading. They're very thoughtful, and they give you an unbiased and objective perspective on climate change. Adaptation and mitigation go together. Now, I want to give a shout out to my friends at Georgia Tech. Next slide. Because it turns out in my little research that I've done since I've been here, Georgia Tech is really good at mitigation. We have a whole bunch of centers here that are nothing but mitigation. We have one in the Carbon Neutral Energy Solutions Lab. We have the Center of Excellence that's been here for 20 years on photovoltaics, one of the best in the world. Bill Koros' work on sequestration is another amazing bit of work. And then we've created these, the Brook Byers Institute in Civil Engineering, and actually it's broader than that, about cities and how do you help cities cut down on their carbon footprint. Sustainability means other things too, but that as well. And Bert Bross and his folks in mechanical engineering working on better, more efficient engines, cutting down on the carbon you're producing. You don't use carbon fuel, but cut down on the carbon emission coming out of those carbon-based fuels. And they're doing a great job. And then recently, our good and departed friend Ray Anderson and his family endowed a center in the Scheller School College on sustainable business practices. So the Smithsonian is busy. Sorry about that. Georgia Tech is busy working on mitigation. Now, what's interesting is I talk to people in these different areas. Many of them didn't know about the people in working on the problem. So I do think Georgia Tech ought to get its mind around this subject. Because you cannot be a forceful advocate for concern unless you put everything together. It's pretty simple to do. We need to do it. Let me also give a shout out to all of you in the campus. Next slide. Because Georgia Tech is a leader in developing a carbon-free environment for its campus operations, as well as reusing water and all the things that you've tried to do here with sustainability, recognized by the Sierra Club, the Green Building Council, the Princeton Review, and the National Wildlife Federation. And those are all recognitions of what you and the campus is doing, and I'm very, very proud of those things. And that is about mitigation. I would just say to you students in the audience, when I first came here, I was just sort of, trying to think about what I would do. And I had a group of students walk into my office and say, Dr. Clough, we don't have a recycling program at Georgia Tech, and we'd like to help you start one. That was the start of sustainability at Georgia Tech's campus. It was student initiated. And today, Georgia Tech is one of the best at recycling of a college campus in the world. And so students can make a difference on the Georgia Tech campus, and you have made a difference in something important. Okay, last slide. Bottom line, climate change is occurring. Every natural system in the world is changing, and changing fast. You cannot deny that. There's no question humans' use of carbon-based fuels is having a significant drive or impact on climate change. You can argue about if it's 50% of 1 degree C or whatever, but it's happening. It's there. It's measurable. You can see it. And the acidity levels in the ocean aren't going up for any non-reason. They're going up because there's way much carbon in the air than there used to be. There's a lot of evidence for it, not just that temperature thing that everybody argues about. I would argue that doing nothing is simply not an option. I took my oath as a civil engineer saying public welfare was my #1 priority. Not now, but 100 years from now. My projects, hopefully, 100 years from now, will protect people. And I have to consider what might happen 100 years from now. Might not, but might. And I mentioned this question of adaptation, building flood walls. Good jobs for civil engineers. Don't want to take those away. You didn't need them anyway, but you'll never build enough flood walls to take care of the problem you have to have mitigation. And there's a lot of work, good work going on in mitigation, and it's having the right effect. And it's not taking jobs away from anybody. We're not going to get rid of carbon-based fuels. We need them. We just have to use them more wisely. And then we have to create jobs through green technologies and other technologies that we use. And finally, engineers need to be part of the dialogue. I don't want to be left out again when somebody makes a decision. And when you hear all these arguments, these talking heads on TV, you never see an engineer. But engineers need to be at the core of these arguments because we need to be thoughtful about it. There are things we have to do as a responsibility of engineers, and we should do it. And the places a lot of this should happen is Georgia Tech. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Clough, for such a thought-provoking lecture. We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
There's one down here.
How are we supposed to stay optimistic about mitigation when we have leaders, senators who might call anthropogenic climate change a hoax?
Well, there is optimism because the statistics are showing we're making a difference. I think if you look at any change that we have, or some challenge our nation faced, let's say the ozone hole. There was a lot of poo-pooing of that in the beginning, and then people began to realize that was serious, and then people began to talk about options. It takes a while for people to begin to come up to a rational approach to those things. And I said it's going to be a compromise. You're not going to do this in one simple fell swoop. We all should be concerned. But I think we're in a dialogue. Unfortunately, right now, I think it's very disjunctured, which is truly unfortunate. But this year, at the end of the year, we actually emitted the same amount of carbon into the atmosphere as we did last year. That's a big step forward. Now, unfortunately, the carbon cycle takes a long time to react to any of this stuff. And so we're probably going to get up to 550 parts per million before this is all done. And that's going to cause a lot more change than we've seen. But hopefully we could stop it somewhere around there. But at the meantime, the point is we keep working on mitigation, keep doing your job here. We'll have to build some flood walls. I say it's good for civil engineers, good job. But hopefully, gradually, society, as you saw, there were people beginning to get concerned about it.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Okay.
I'll hang around down here and answer questions for those of you who'd like to have.
Come down. What do we have?
Give us the reading list of the reports.
Okay.
Reports that you gave, could you put that on the CEE website?
They want the reading list of the
Is
reports.
this archived in the libraries or something?
Yeah, I
Is
think we
this
can find them.
archived in the libraries? I think it's
Yeah.
archived.
If you just
Yeah.
gave a list of them, we can go find
Yeah,
them.
I haven't got anything written about it. It changes like every week.
Whatever you talked about, all I talked about.
Yeah, appreciate that, yeah.
What, other than carbon increases, is causing the rising temperature, global warming?
Well, there are natural causes, and there are reasons to believe, there are scientists who, I think, have a rational position that some of this is due to natural causes, but clearly some of it's due to man-made causes. And all we can do something about is the part that's man-made, and we could try to slow it down ourselves. There's no sense in, the issue here is rate. If we keep pumping carbon in at this very high rate, what we learned from the Peenham was you can set off something that is a major expulsion of carbon from other sources. We would like not to trigger that. And there's no sign that nature is trying to do that we are instigating that.
What was the source of the high carbon at that time?
Did you hear that?
The question is, what was the source of the high carbon at that time?
Say it again now.
What was the source of the high carbon?
Oh, the source of the high carbon?
Yeah.
Well, basically, when we started using carbon-based fuel, this largely carbon-based fuel, that's a big source of the carbon. Now, there's natural carbon, and we need carbon to survive, and carbon is part of a carbon cycle, and that's all part and parcel of the natural system. It's just that man interjected itself we interjected ourselves with the Industrial Revolution when we started a carbon-based fuel cycle. And we added 6 billion people, all of us who use carbon-based fuel.
But when
Okay, I apologize, we are going to have to end this because there's going to be a class coming in. We can continue the conversation at a reception outside. Please join me in giving a warm hand to Dr. Clough.